An unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But a married man is anxious about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And he is divided. As near as I can recall, celibacy for the sake of the kingdom, Catholic priesthood in my case, didn't enter my consciousness as a possibility until I was a couple years into college. Some of my earliest school memories are of chasing a girl in preschool, of leaving one at the altar in kindergarten, and wondering why she would never give me another try. I grew up in what I would consider a devout Catholic home, but I don't recall celibacy being part of my worldview. We had no Catholic school to weave this into my formation or to host a vocations day or speak often of the saints. Good people taught religious ed, but the 80s and 90s bore the scars of the 60s and 70s. No, my worldview was shaped by a faithful family and good people, a limited catechesis, and a heavy dose of the Midwest U.S.'s priorities. The Dukes of Hazzard wowed us with their fast car and cute cousin Daisy. Cheers made us laugh and look at Mayday Malone's Way with the Women. Saved by the Bell in Beverly Hills 90210 showed us what life and relationships were all about. While Three's Company, The Love Boat, and Magnum P.I. gave us a glimpse of adult relational maturity. Thankfully, we had records and radio to balance out these one-sided TV shows. When I was just 6, John Anderson taught me about swinging with little Charlotte Johnson, who was really looking good. Randy Travis stoked my hopes for someone I could love, even if all her hair fell out, forever and ever, amen. Willie Nelson encouraged me to have someone special always on my mind. Garth Brooks advised I shouldn't wait to tell her I loved her just in case tomorrow never comes. Alan Jackson revealed that I could survive without anything else as long as I was living on love. And the odds were pretty good with 7 women on my mind, 4 that want to own me, 2 that want to stone me, and 1 says she's a friend of mine. But just in case it didn't work out, well, I knew I'd be all right with my friends in low places, who hopefully wouldn't land me in the Hotel California, but with a witchy woman, that'd be just fine. No doubt it was the depiction of Fat Friar Tuck and Robin Hood and the priest and the Princess Bride that saved the day and inspired my vocation. Marriage. Marriage is what has brought us together today. When you look at it from this perspective, it seems all the more miraculous and otherworldly for a man or a woman to hear God's call to celibacy in our day. Surely this was largely why I struggled with it all the way up to the night before my diaconate ordination. Celibacy is nowhere held out in the popular culture today. It simply doesn't exist in that worldview, except maybe as something dysfunctional and depressing, or to be pitied and remedied with a little therapy. But if none of the popular songs we sing or stories we tell support or even allow for this possibility of foregoing a good for the sake of another world, might this not be troubling for the whole of Christianity, originating as it does in the man Jesus, who is never romantically involved or married? The stories we tell and the shows we watch, the songs we sing and the books we read form our capacity to see and to hear, as well as the horizons of our dreams. If you control the narrative, you control the possibilities, which is why so many spend their lives dissatisfied, living as a character in someone else's poorly constructed story. If you control the narrative, you control the possibilities. I thought of this the other day when I read an article about the San Francisco School Board. using the criteria of whether the person promoted slavery, genocide, the oppression of women, or otherwise significantly diminished the opportunities of those amongst us to the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the board voted to rename 44 schools, including ones named after Paul Revere, Daniel Webster, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and yes, even Abraham Lincoln. If one's worldview is shaped by a philosophy that has cut all ties with the past, can't conceive of its dependency on flawed humanity, won't pay respect to anything with which it disagrees, and rejects all of God's redemptive story, then with humility, forgiveness, and conversion wiped away, the only thing left is to tear down and build anew, like we Americans with buildings are prone to do. If you write those figures out of our story, you can reshape its trajectory and the dreams and values of its citizenry. This also came to mind as we celebrated Catholic schools last week. Catholic education allows for all disciplines to be situated in God's grand story. This provides coherence to the whole, so we don't just learn isolated facts and theories, but create an overarching narrative. Thus, its horizons are more expansive than the public alternative. Write Christianity out of the story, as was done in my 17 years of public schooling, and you could still do science, art, music, and literature, but lost is the higher purpose and the debt they and our country owe to Christianity. In what sense such an education could be considered comprehensive, I cannot see. Disruption to our narrative and worldview can come from outside, as I just described, and from the inside. I'll never forget my dad's response to a theology book from my college days given to me by a priest. It called into question the nature of God, and not knowing any better, I suggested my dad give it a read. His response, if it were up to me, I wouldn't read it, I'd burn it. Only much later did I understand his animated reply. Distortions and hostility from without is to be expected. It's part of Christianity's history and a natural response to our missionary activity. But distortions and corruptions from within are deadly. They compromise the strength and credibility of a unified story. Wolves are one thing, wolves in sheep's clothing are something else. At one level, the pandemic has provided the occasion for such things. For when young families, those least likely to be affected by COVID-19, excuse themselves from Mass and communion for almost a year now, but participate in other public offerings, it makes it look to the kids that you can survive just fine without religion, sacraments, and such things. School, sports, and shopping are worth the risk, but Jesus, I don't think so. Even more troubling and destructive has been the example of our Catholic president. Praised as devout by the same press seeking reduced religious liberties, he continues to advance access to abortion. I mention it, as I did last week, because it's easiest to see, the clearest example of what I mean. Forbidding abortion was a hallmark distinguishing early Christianity, and procuring one evokes excommunication automatically. By what rationale can support of such a position be considered moral and leave one in good standing? It's not a question of policy, but of the most prominent example of Catholicity in our country. Sever the connection with the past, make oneself the absolute authority, and distorted becomes the narrative, and confused and controlled become especially our children's possibilities. For the story of Jesus begins to seem unimportant and simply untrue. likely with greater reluctance than my dad had, and implicitly rebuking that priest, do I thus speak. But outweighing such reluctance is my hope for you, and especially our children, that your lives aren't lived in someone else's inconsistent and illicit narrative, but in God's grand story.